Have you ever wondered if a country you know is about to sink into misery? Yes. Countries that will collapse in a matter of time if they haven't already. Places where prosperity, security, and well-being have been replaced by a sinister agony. No, I'm not lying to you. Today, we'll take you on a journey through the 10 European countries most likely to collapse, but don't leave. Because halfway through the video, I'll reveal the one country in the world doing the exact opposite, rising from the ashes to become a global powerhouse in the shadows. 10. Germany. Let's start where it hurts the most. The powerhouse that for decades was considered the backbone of the European Union. Germany, the industrial giant that rose from the ashes of 2 world wars, is now showing signs of exhaustion. Its renowned economic engines are starting to creak. The reasons are not singular but a tangle of interconnected factors exerting suffocating pressure. An aging population is straining the welfare state, with pensions becoming unsustainable and a labor market growing less dynamic. Low birth rates and increased life expectancy have created a demographic imbalance threatening the social security system. Energy dependence has become an Achilles heel, driving up production costs and jeopardizing competitiveness. The transition to renewables, while necessary, has been costly and has sparked uncertainty in the industrial sector. Political corruption, once nearly imperceptible, is creeping into the halls of power. Cases of bribery in infrastructure contracts and the misappropriation of public funds have eroded public trust in leaders. The mass influx of immigrants, initially met with optimism, has fueled rising social tensions, with marginalized groups vulnerable to extremism. The pandemic, far from being a temporary hurdle, exposed cracks in the healthcare system and government response. Crisis management policies were criticized for their slowness and lack of coordination, fueling public dissatisfaction. Today, the once invincible Germany is dragged down by a slowdown that's hard to reverse. Exports, long a strength, face fierce global competition and unpredictable international demand. The labor market is no longer the same. Younger generations face cutthroat job competition, while mass immigration, poorly managed in the long term, has led to social tensions. Ineffective integration has resulted in divided communities and rising crime in some urban areas. 9. Italy. The cradle of the Renaissance, home to a millennia-old culture, faces a decline that seems endless. Italy is drowning in debt, with an overwhelmed public sector unable to meet its commitments. Political corruption isn't just a rumor. It's an endemic disease eroding institutions, stalling development and fueling public discontent. Recurring cases of bribery in construction, misappropriation of EU development funds, and favoritism in public contracts have shattered trust in the government. Partisan disputes are daily fare, and government instability has cost the country credibility with investors and international organizations. Constant administrative changes hinder long-term policy implementation, creating economic and political uncertainty. The uncontrolled arrival of immigrants landing on its shores, fleeing crises across the Mediterranean, sparks deep social tensions, fueling racism and xenophobia in some regions. Italy's streets, once filled with tourists, now reflect economic uncertainty. The pandemic left an indelible mark on its healthcare system and productive fabric, crippling entire sectors like tourism and manufacturing. Young people can't find work, are forced to emigrate, and those who stay see a tired country with no clear future. The gap between rich and poor has widened, with a shrinking middle class and a population at risk of poverty. Italy embodies a slow, painful collapse, a nation unable to lift its head. The lack of structural reforms and resistance to change have trapped the country in a cycle of growing debt and underinvestment in key sectors. 8. Poland. This country seemed to have found a path to growth after joining the EU. A nation with a forward-looking, youthful society eager to carve out a better future. But today, the reality is different. Political tension is unbearable, with a government facing internal criticism and external pressures. Freedoms, many say, are threatened by controversial laws and disputes with the EU. Illegal immigration from eastern borders creates tensions with neighbors and within society, which sees its cities and cultural identity changing without a clear plan. The pandemic weakened the healthcare system and strained the economy, with businesses and shops closing their doors. Corruption, seeping from the highest levels, undermines public trust in institutions. Poland, once a young European promise, is now caught between the sword of political rigidity and the wall of social instability. Social protests have surged, with demonstrations demanding greater government transparency and structural reforms. The youth, disillusioned by the lack of opportunities, feel trapped in a system that offers little support for innovation and entrepreneurship. Poland's reliance on traditional industries makes it vulnerable to global market fluctuations and automation, which threatens to displace many workers. 7. Bosnia and Herzegovina. The scars of war still bleed here. The country has not overcome the ethnic tensions lingering from past conflicts. Corruption isn't just a problem, it's the air breathed in many offices. Institutions, still fragile from history, struggle to maintain an order that feels fleeting. The economy teeters, unable to attract stable investment. Local businesses face unfair competition from foreign investors, often more interested in exploiting resources than fostering sustainable development. Poverty is endemic, with citizens struggling daily to survive. Unemployment rates, especially among youth, are alarming, with few prospects for the future in a country marked by instability. Internal migration, emigration of thousands seeking a better future abroad, and precarious labor conditions contribute to a sense of hopelessness. Young people grow up in the shadow of a conflict that never fully fades, in an environment where violence and uncertainty are constant. The pandemic, with its wave of illness and death, exposed a precarious healthcare system and a government unable to manage the emergency. Healthcare infrastructure was inadequate, and a lack of coordination worsened the crisis, leaving many communities unprotected and vulnerable. Bosnia and Herzegovina is the image of a country where past wounds prevent building a future. The lack of social cohesion and ongoing influence of external actors further complicate the situation, creating an environment where hope is scarce. 6. Spain, the sun of southern Europe. The country that for decades was a dream tourist destination is now plunging into an abyss of uncertainty. Corruption is a regular guest in newspaper headlines, with scandalous cases involving politicians, businessmen, and bankers. The political class seems more interested in clinging to power than saving the nation. Corruption scandals have weakened trust in institutions, fostering cynicism and distrust among citizens. Unemployment, especially among youth, is a monster devouring the dreams of new generations. Despite efforts to reduce rates, many young people face temporary contracts, low wages, and few opportunities for advancement. Underinvestment in education and vocational training has left many workers unprepared for a globalized job market. The housing crisis is so severe that skyrocketing rents and illegal property occupations fuel tensions. Major cities like Madrid and Barcelona face a shortage of affordable housing, forcing families into precarious conditions or out of their homes. This issue is exacerbated by mass immigration, adding pressure to an already saturated market. Separatist tensions tear at the country's identity, fracturing the unity once taken for granted. Independence movements in regions like Catalonia have led to political and social clashes, sometimes turning violent. The lack of effective dialogue between the central government and regions has deepened these conflicts, threatening to tear the country apart. Mass immigration adds more strain to an already stretched system, creating ghettos and racial tensions. Integration policies have been inadequate, and the lack of resources for education, healthcare, and jobs for immigrants has bred resentment and conflict in some communities. The pandemic hit especially hard, sinking key sectors like tourism and hospitality. Restrictions and forced closures bankrupted countless businesses, spiking unemployment and leaving families without livelihoods. Recovery has been slow and uneven, with entire regions struggling to return to pre-pandemic levels. Spain feels disoriented, with a society tired of empty promises and a clouded horizon. The lack of leadership and inability to implement structural reforms have trapped the country in a cycle of rising debt and underinvestment in key sectors. Halfway point, the rising star. We've reached the halfway mark, and as promised, here's the country that's rising and evolving. That country is El Salvador. Under Nayib Bukele's leadership, it's emerging as an economic powerhouse. With bold policies, strengthened security, and a push for technological innovation, the country is attracting investment and boosting local entrepreneurship. Adopting Bitcoin, ensuring legal stability, and emphasizing digitalization have generated confidence, dynamism, and growth, placing El Salvador on the global radar as a new revelation. Want to know how much money this country's president has invested in cryptocurrencies? We'll reveal that at the end of the video. Let's continue. 5. Greece. The cradle of philosophy, the mother of modern democracy, is now a chilling example of economic collapse. Since the debt crisis erupted over a decade ago, Greece has failed to heal its wounds. The country is suffocated by colossal public debt, a ball and chain dragging it down. Financial bailouts have kept the economy afloat, but at a social and political cost that left deep scars. The informal economy, corruption, nepotism, and distrust in institutions deter growth. Small and medium-sized businesses struggle to survive in an environment where bureaucracy and lack of transparency are the norm. Tax evasion is endemic, significantly reducing state revenue and hindering effective policy implementation. Young people, without opportunities, flee abroad, draining the nation of its most skilled workforce. Youth unemployment rates remain alarmingly high, and the lack of job prospects has sparked an identity and purpose crisis among the young. The mass exodus of talent has left a hard-to-fill void in key economic sectors. The pandemic was the final straw, exposing the weaknesses of a barely sustainable healthcare system. Healthcare infrastructure was overwhelmed, and underinvestment in public health has left the country vulnerable to future crises. Inadequate medical care and a shortage of trained staff worsened the situation, leaving many without access to basic services. Meanwhile, migratory pressure, with thousands arriving on its shores, further complicates social stability. Xenophobia, resentment, and desperation mix into an explosive cocktail. Asylum and reception policies have been ineffective, creating divided and constantly conflicting communities. Greece, so rich in history, is crumbling like marble eroded by the acid rain of today's reality. The lack of structural reforms and resistance to change have trapped the country in a cycle of growing debt and underinvestment in education, technology, and infrastructure. Distrust in institutions and government has fueled political instability, with frequent leadership changes and a fragmented political landscape hindering long-term policies. The lack of social cohesion and ongoing external influence further complicate the situation, creating an environment where hope is scarce. 4. Hungary. A country that promised stability, modernization, and economic takeoff is now trapped between international suspicion and domestic discontent. Hungary is experiencing a political drift, with the opposition accusing the government of undermining democracy and freedoms. Reforms in recent years have weakened the separation of powers, concentrating authority in the executive and restricting press and expression freedoms. Corruption, cronyism, and pressure on the media create a suffocating climate. Transparency. International reports rising corruption levels, with corrupt practices infiltrating key sectors like construction, energy, and public services. Lack of transparency in government processes has eroded public trust, fostering an environment of impunity. Meanwhile, Immigration from eastern and southern borders generates enormous tensions. Restrictive and often racist immigration policies have created deep societal divisions, with communities split between those favoring openness and those advocating stricter border control. Ineffective integration has led to isolated communities and rising crime in some urban areas. The labor market suffers from precarity, low wages, and uncertainty. Underinvestment in innovative sectors and resistance to technological modernization have left Hungary lagging behind other European nations. The lack of job opportunities and internal migration to more developed areas have deepened regional disconnection. The pandemic exposed healthcare system weaknesses and the government's incoherent responses. Healthcare infrastructure was overwhelmed, and poor coordination and planning worsened the crisis, leaving communities unprotected and vulnerable. Underinvestment in public health and healthcare training has left the country ill-prepared for future emergencies. Hungary is hurtling toward a point of no return, while the EU watches its drift with growing concern. Sanctions and threats of intervention from the EU have created international isolation, complicating access to funds and support to address internal crises. Rising tensions with other EU members have further isolated Hungary, exacerbating its economic and social challenges. 3. Netherlands. Known for years as a model of stability, modernity, and efficiency, the Netherlands is now facing a critical moment few predicted. The cost of living has skyrocketed, fueling resentment among a middle class feeling increasingly suffocated. Housing prices have reached unsustainable levels, forcing families into precarious conditions or out of their homes in search of more affordable options. Unplanned mass immigration has created cracks in the social fabric, with entire neighborhoods under strain, a shortage of affordable housing, and cultural clashes the government seems unable to manage. Integration policies have been inadequate, and the lack of resources for education, healthcare, and jobs for immigrants has bred resentment and conflict in some communities. The proliferation of informal settlements and lack of effective urban planning have worsened housing and public service issues. Environmental protests, labor strikes, and corruption allegations in high places, where big corporations wield influence behind the scenes, tarnish the country's reputation. Austerity policies have sparked public discontent, with citizens feeling their needs are ignored in favor of corporate and financial interests. Lack of transparency in government decisions has eroded trust, fostering distrust and dissatisfaction. The pandemic exposed an overwhelmed healthcare system that couldn't respond with expected efficiency. Underinvestment in healthcare infrastructure has left the country vulnerable to future crises. Delays in vaccine distribution and poor coordination between local and national authorities fueled frustration. Today, the Netherlands, the land of tolerance and prosperity, reveals its vulnerability. Underinvestment in education, technology, and infrastructure has left the country lagging behind global competitors. Reliance on certain economic sectors has created a less diversified economy, vulnerable to global market fluctuations and internal crises. 2. United Kingdom. The former imperial power, the nation that once ruled oceans and continents, is now suffering a historic setback. Brexit left deep scars, generating trade uncertainty, loss of investment, and tensions with the EU. Leaving the EU not only impacted the economy, but also diplomatic relations and cooperation in areas like security, research, and trade. Inflation is soaring, basic goods are becoming unaffordable, and industries are seeking more favorable destinations. Economic uncertainty has reduced consumption and foreign investment. Small and medium-sized businesses, the backbone of the British economy, struggle to survive in a volatile and unpredictable environment. Unemployment is rising, and with it, social unrest. Unemployment rates have spiked, especially in sectors hit by offshoring and automation. The lack of job opportunities has increased crime and social tensions, with increasingly divided and resentful communities. Immigration, supposedly under control post-Brexit, remains a hot-button issue, with irregular arrivals and poor planning. Restrictive immigration policies have caused labor shortages in key sectors like healthcare, agriculture, and hospitality, creating labor market imbalances and tensions between local workers and immigrants. The pandemic hit hard, exposing public healthcare deficiencies and the government's inability to anticipate crises. Delays in response, lack of coordination, and underinvestment in healthcare have left the country vulnerable to future emergencies. Distrust in the healthcare system has fueled uncertainty and skepticism. Political corruption, visible in opaque contracts and questionable decisions, undermines public trust. Corruption scandals have rocked the government's image, with accusations of favoritism and embezzlement eroding leaders' credibility. Lack of transparency and accountability has created a climate of distrust and discontent. Street protests, the housing crisis, and discontent with elites mix into a dangerous cocktail. Demonstrations have surged, with citizens demanding structural changes and greater transparency. The lack of effective responses from authorities has heightened tensions, creating an environment of social and political instability. The United Kingdom we knew is fading, losing influence and sinking in its own sea of problems. Its diminishing global role, combined with internal crises, has left the country in a vulnerable position with lasting repercussions. 1. Ukraine. We've reached the epicenter of chaos. Ukraine is a living symbol of permanent instability. Under geopolitical pressure and amid armed conflicts tearing apart its territory and society, the country suffers from deeply entrenched corruption, making a healthy political system hard to imagine. The economy, devastated by war and mismanagement, is a wasteland of uncertainty. The local currency is collapsing, infrastructure lies in ruins, and the population lives with constant fear of the next outbreak of violence. Inflation is soaring, basic goods are unaffordable for most, and unemployment is overwhelming. Unemployment is brutal, infrastructure is crumbling, crime is spiking, and internal and external migration scatters entire families seeking safety. The lack of job opportunities has triggered an emigration wave, leaving the country with a weakened workforce and an increasingly fragmented society. Forced immigration and internal displacement of thousands fleeing conflict zones create rising tensions. Cities hosting refugees struggle to provide basic services, creating an environment of overload and stress that exacerbates social tensions. Poor planning and inadequate resources have led to precarious living conditions in many refugee settlements. The pandemic was a lethal blow to an already fragile healthcare system, lacking the means to treat thousands of patients. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and shortages of staff and medical supplies worsened the crisis. The lack of a coordinated, effective response left communities unprotected and vulnerable to future crises. Street insecurity stifles hope, and the constant presence of armed conflict creates an atmosphere of fear and despair. The ongoing threat of violence and lack of a peaceful resolution have left the country in constant turmoil, where peace feels like a distant illusion. Ukraine is sinking into darkness, marking the climax of this list of foretold collapses. The combination of corruption, war, economic, and health crises has created a perfect storm threatening to destroy the country's social and political fabric. The lack of effective leadership and ongoing external interference have blocked any chance of recovery, trapping the country in a cycle of destruction and despair. El Salvador's Bitcoin investment. Want to know how much El Salvador's president has invested in cryptocurrencies? Under President Nayib Bukele's administration, El Salvador has made significant investments in Bitcoin since its adoption as legal tender in September 2021. According to recent data, the country holds approximately 6,180 Bitcoins, acquired at an average price of $44,739.80 per unit. With Bitcoin's recent surge past $100,000, El Salvador's portfolio has seen remarkable appreciation. President Bukele announced that the country's Bitcoin reserves are now worth 127.30% more than their purchase price, representing a net gain of over $344 million. We've journeyed through the ailing heart of Europe, a continent where 10 of its most iconic nations are experiencing the crumbling of their foundations. What was once a space of integration, prosperity, and stability is now riddled with corruption, political mismanagement, health crises, unplanned mass immigration, unemployment, and internal conflicts that can no longer be swept under the rug. Germany, Italy, Poland, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Spain, Greece, Hungary, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Ukraine each face their own abysses threatening their immediate future. I invite you to like and subscribe if you found this content valuable, enlightening, or at least thought-provoking. That way, you can stay updated on future revelations and analyses that help us better understand the uncertain path the world is taking. In the face of uncertainty, information is the best weapon, and knowledge is the first step toward changing course before it's too late.